We're back for your ears only. I'm Eddie Robinson.
I'm David Alpern with this quote from the news. America can contact me whenever it wants to. That was Hafiz Mohammed Saeed, leader of the Pakistani-based terrorist group Lashkar-e-Taiba, at a news conference near the Rawalpindi military headquarters, mocking the U.S. Department of State for offering a $10 million reward for information on his whereabouts. The bounty was condemned by Pakistani officials and further widened the gap in trust between the two nations. Now this.
A cessation of violence is an important beginning, but we must move quickly forward on the political process to meet the aspirations of the Syrian people.
Even the promised cessation of violence that was seen as simply a first step to real peace in Syria last week by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan quickly seemed largely an illusion. Although President Bashar Assad moved military units away from some cities, there were stepped-up government assaults in others, notably Doma near Damascus, Rastan north of Homs, and Homs itself, as we just heard. Meanwhile, the kind of military aid that rebel forces had long hoped for, largely from Saudi Arabia and Qatar, seemed more likely to foster bloody civil war than end it with an opposition victory.
And some conservative leaders in the region, as well as officials in Washington, are relatively thankful for that. They are fearful of both successful Assad as an ally to Iran and of a successful opposition quickly dominated by Islamist elements like the Muslim Brotherhood that is now gaining ever more political power in Egypt. To consider all those factors for your ears only, we're joined again by Ayham Kamel, Mideast analyst for Eurasia Group, international risk consultants. Welcome back to our program.
Thank you for having me.
What is the level of military and financial support now getting through to the opposition, and what effect do you see it having on their efforts and therefore the regime?
There's always been some sort of form of support, either financial to the opposition, and now we're moving into another territory where Gulf states, mainly Saudi Arabia and Qatar, provide arms, light arms mainly, funding for the army, basically to create a more coherent armed movement against Assad. The hope is that with time, this movement would gain more credibility, more support, and be able to threaten Assad forces and contain his regime. That's moving incrementally. I don't see any immediate effect on the opposition. Arms are hard to smuggle across the border. It will take time. It will take effort to build up these networks. So it will definitely help, but we're not likely to see any change overnight.
There's also a stream of outside funds to buy military defections. How successful?
Nothing yet on that front. With time, I would imagine that it would be more successful. But Assad has built up multiple safeguards against these kind of movements. He inherited this tactic from his father. The army is very divided. They communicate with Assad only. And there's really no place that defecting officers could go safely and attack Assad. That's partly why we haven't seen a lot of defections. But with more money, a more coherent opposition, I think we're likely to move towards some more defections.
What happened to the idea of a humanitarian zone or zones?
That idea was discussed in various meetings in Turkey, the Friends of Syria meeting, in Riyadh with Secretary Clinton present, but I think the risks are too high. So it was discussed, but eventually this idea was discarded, at least temporarily. It doesn't seem that plausible. It would entail multiple significant threats to the armies involved or any air force involved on that effort.
What about those who favor a more robust military intervention like the one that toppled Gaddafi in Libya?
Well, at this point in time, any sort of military intervention in Syria would be very difficult. Assad's army is advanced, capable, and it has an air force that is going to be hard to engage. So I think the mission in Syria would be much more difficult. That's why we see some reluctance in terms of international intervention. And I just don't see us heading in that direction, not in an election year in the U.S.
In the event that some military action or stepped-up economic sanctions do force Assad out, how do you see the power vacuum being filled? By military leaders, as in Egypt, by competing ethnic and tribal factions, as in Libya now?
Well, we're just going to have multiple forces, multiple parties that have control over different regions. We're not likely to see something coherent come out of this immediately. Basically, defectors or the Free Syrian Army would have control over several areas. You would see the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria gain more prominence. But also, in different regions, tribal leaders, sectarian leaders would have de facto control. So we're looking at a much more complicated scenario for Syria, and this is partially why international powers are reluctant to intervene.
What are the implications in Egypt of Muslim Brotherhood victories in parliamentary elections and now the decision to run a presidential candidate?
Well, the direct implication, I think, the impact on Egypt would be that the Muslim Brotherhood will be responsible for the economy, for political decisions. It cannot basically blame other parties, the military council, or other political parties for any shortcomings. Egypt faces very difficult challenges, significant ones. And in this scenario, we're looking at a Muslim Brotherhood that is the only party to blame if anything goes wrong.
We also see Iran undermining the supposed diplomatic breakthrough for multi-party talks about its nuclear program, objecting to Turkey as the location because it's putting pressure on Assad. But we're told that economic sanctions are beginning to bite deep enough to affect Tehran's policy. How do you see that scenario playing out?
Well, there's a rift on the Turkey side, there's a rift between Ankara and Tehran. The main issue is Syria. They just do not see eye to eye on that issue. And the Islamic Republic of Iran is very wary of Turkey's role in supporting the armed opposition against Assad. But Iran is hedging. Sanctions are beginning to bite. You can see the Islamic Republic's economy deteriorating. The rial, the local currency, has depreciated. So we're likely to see some movement in Iran becoming more flexible. But at the same time, I am worried that Iran is negotiating for just having a process, for the sake of having a process, rather than reaching a final settlement over its nuclear program.
Containment seems to be a four-letter word when it comes to a nuclear-capable Iran, though it did work against the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Could there be stability at a level where Iran is just short of actually having a weapon, but close enough to serve as the deterrent it seems to want at the very least?
Well, what's important here, David, is that there are no good options for any of the parties involved. A military attack on Iran would be very difficult. It would entail significant risks, and it would have a direct impact on the price of oil and economic recovery across the globe. So I think we're facing very difficult scenarios. And if there is an option to stop Iran's nuclear program before it reaches an advanced degree of militarization, I think the international community would accept some form of safeguards installed to stop Iran.
Ayham Kamel, Mideast analyst for Eurasia Group, international risk consultants.
Quote from the news, up to today, they're not getting high marks for this. That was an anonymous Western official on Afghanistan President Hamid Karzai ordering a special prosecutor and tribunal on the near collapse of the Kabul Bank, a symbol of the country's crony capitalism and corruption.
Next, social networks and social change, from Tahrir to Trayvon Martin, for your ears only.